The note was barely the size of a sticky pad, folded twice over, pressed flat against my palm before I even realized she had slipped it into my hand. I was reaching for the bread basket when I felt her fingers brush mine beneath the edge of the tablecloth, deliberate, quick, gone before anyone could notice. My daughter-in-law pulled her hand back and lifted her wine glass as though nothing had happened, laughing softly at something the notary was saying about traffic on the 401. I excused myself to use the bathroom. Standing in the hallway outside the powder room, under the framed watercolor of Georgian Bay that my wife had bought at a craft fair in Collingwood the summer before she got sick, I unfolded the paper. 4 words, written fast, the pen pressed hard enough to dent the paper. Don't sign anything tonight. And then, below that, smaller, please trust me. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of my son's laughter drifting down the hall, low and easy and completely at home in the house I had lived in for 31 years. I folded the note back up and slipped it into my shirt pocket. Then I walked back to the table, smiled at the notary, and told him I was feeling a little off, something I'd eaten, probably, nothing serious, and asked if we might reschedule. My son's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. 8 months earlier, I had stood in a hospital corridor in Mississauga, while a doctor I had never met told me my wife of 40 years was gone. A stroke. Fast. She hadn't suffered, he said, which I suppose was meant to be a comfort. I drove home alone in February sleet, turned off all the lights in the house, and sat in our kitchen until the sun came up. My wife had been the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept a bag of dog treats by the front door for the neighbor's retriever, who alphabetized the spice rack, and somehow made that feel like an act of love rather than a quirk. The house without her was not a house anymore. It was just a building I happened to sleep in. My son called 2 days after the funeral. He was living in Calgary at the time, working in something to do with real estate development. I never fully understood what he did, only that it paid well and required him to wear expensive clothes and fly to meetings. He said he was worried about me. He said it wasn't right, his father being alone in a big house in Oakville at 68 years old. He said he and his wife had talked about it and they wanted to come back to Ontario, be closer, help me through this. I told him he didn't have to do that. He said he wanted to. My daughter-in-law called separately the next evening. She was quieter than usual, more careful with her words, which I had always taken as shyness. She asked how I was sleeping, whether I was eating properly, whether the pipes had frozen during that cold snap. She sounded genuinely worried. I told her the pipes were fine. They moved into the guest wing of the house in March, 6 weeks after the funeral. My son said it was temporary, just until he found a suitable property nearby, but temporary had a way of becoming permanent when no one said otherwise. At first, it was good. The house felt less cavernous. There was food in the refrigerator that I hadn't put there myself. My son drove me to my cardiologist appointments and waited in the lobby with his laptop open, which I appreciated more than I told him. My daughter-in-law cooked on Sunday evenings, proper meals, roast chicken and potatoes, the kind of dinner that required plates rather than a bowl and a spoon standing over the sink. The changes happened slowly enough that I almost didn't register them as changes. My son suggested I let him manage the day-to-day finances. Just to simplify things, he said. Dad, you've got enough to think about. I was a retired high school geography teacher with a decent pension, a paid-off house, and 40 years of careful saving. I had never been reckless with money. But grief does something strange to a person's confidence. It makes you doubt your own competence in ways that have nothing to do with competence. I handed him the binder where I kept the account numbers and passwords. I told myself it was temporary. My online banking notifications were turned off. I didn't notice for 3 weeks. He began joining my phone calls with my financial advisor, sitting beside me at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, nodding along, occasionally asking questions that sounded informed and reasonable. My advisor, a pleasant man I'd worked with for 12 years, seemed to accept his presence without question. I told myself it was helpful to have a second set of ears. The mail started going to a P.O. box my son had set up to prevent fraud, he said. You'd be amazed how much identity theft targets seniors. He didn't say the word seniors like it was an insult, exactly. But there was something in the phrasing that settled over me like a coat that didn't quite fit. I stopped asking about the account statements. In the fall, my son mentioned the power of attorney. He brought it up carefully, over coffee on a Saturday morning, The way you'd present a slightly complicated idea to someone you weren't sure would follow it. He'd spoken to a lawyer, he said, an estate planning specialist. Given my age and my health, the heart thing, he said, delicately, it made sense to have a document in place. A continuing power of attorney for property. Standard practice, he said. Everyone does it eventually. I said I'd think about it. 2 weeks later, he mentioned it again. Then again, a few days after that. Each time the framing shifted slightly, it was for my protection. It was what Mum would have wanted. It was simply responsible planning for a man in my position. I found myself agreeing more each time. The way you agree to things when someone persistent and well-meaning wears the edges off your resistance. I didn't involve my own lawyer. My son said his estate specialist could handle the whole thing, keep it simple, no need to drag in additional parties and run up fees. I accepted that without pushing back, which was something I would think about later with no small amount of shame. The dinner was scheduled for a Thursday evening in November. My son had invited the notary over, not the lawyer, just the notary, for the signing, because apparently the document was already drafted and reviewed and ready. There was wine. There was a beef tenderloin my daughter-in-law had spent the afternoon preparing. It felt festive, almost celebratory, which should have struck me as odd for what was essentially paperwork. My daughter-in-law was quieter than usual throughout the meal. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that stopped not immediately, but eventually. She refilled glasses and passed dishes and smiled when spoken to, but she was somewhere else inside herself. Once, when my son was talking about a property he'd been looking at in Burlington, I caught her watching me across the table. Not the way you watch someone when you're listening to a conversation. The way you watch someone when you're trying to decide whether to say something. That was when I felt the note pressed into my palm. I didn't sleep that night. My daughter-in-law came to the kitchen early the next morning while my son was still upstairs. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me at the table, both hands wrapped around the mug, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Outside the kitchen window, the backyard was white with the first real snow of the season, and the bird feeder my wife had hung from the maple tree was empty and still. She said she hadn't been able to sleep either. She set her phone on the table between us and turned the screen toward me. The first thing I looked at was the date on the bank statement, an account I didn't recognize, held at a credit union in Calgary. My son's name was on it. Over the past 7 months, a series of transfers had moved money into it. From my TFSA, from my non-registered investment account, from the joint checking account I had never thought to close after my wife passed, where my pension deposit still landed every month. The total was just over $230,000. I didn't say anything for a long time. The coffee in my cup went cold. She told me how she'd found it. She hadn't been looking, not at first. She'd needed access to a shared cloud folder she and my son used for household expenses, and she'd opened the wrong account on his laptop by mistake. The browser had auto-filled the banking login before she realized what she was looking at. She'd meant to close it immediately, but the numbers were wrong in a way that stopped her hand on the trackpad. Transfers she didn't recognize, in amounts that didn't correspond to anything she knew about their finances. She'd taken photographs of the screen before closing the browser. That was 6 weeks ago. She had spent those 6 weeks trying to understand what she was looking at. She'd gone back when she could, carefully, checking when he was out. She found the correspondence with the estate lawyer, not a reputable Oakville firm, but a sole practitioner out of Brampton with a disciplinary note on the Law Society's public registry. She found emails discussing the power of attorney document. She found a separate email thread, which she almost hadn't opened, between my son and a retirement residence in Hamilton that offered what they called memory care transition packages. I had no memory issues. I had never been assessed for memory issues. My GP had told me at my last physical that I was sharp as ever, perhaps sharper than most men my age, and had laughed when I correctly named all 5 of the Great Lakes in order of surface area. She hadn't gone to the police yet because she wasn't sure I would believe her. She wasn't sure I would choose her account over my son's. She said she had written the note because she was running out of time. The notary was already coming and she didn't know what else to do. I believed her immediately. I think I had known something was wrong for months and had chosen not to know it, which is a different thing entirely. I asked her to send me copies of everything she had photographed. Then I called my own lawyer. I had used the same firm since I bought the house in 1993, a small practice in downtown Oakville, 3 partners and a reception desk, staffed by a woman who always remembered which of my daughters-in-law I was asking about. My own lawyer had retired 3 years prior, but his colleague, a sharp, careful woman in her 50s, took my call within the hour. I told her I needed to come in urgently and that I needed her to flag anything unusual about a power of attorney document I was going to bring her. I didn't explain more than that on the phone. My daughter-in-law and I sat at the kitchen table for another hour, going through everything she had gathered. There were 17 bank transfer records. There were the emails about the Hamilton residence. There were documents I found myself once I knew what to look for, a brokerage statement forwarded to a new mailing address that was not my P.O. box, not my house, an address in Etobicoke I had never seen before. When my son came downstairs at 9:30, we were both sitting quietly with our coffees, as though the morning were perfectly ordinary. He asked if everything was all right. I told him my stomach was still bothering me from the night before. He made a sympathetic sound and poured himself a bowl of cereal and talked about a contractor he needed to call about the Burlington property. My daughter-in-law washed the dishes and did not look at him. I drove to my lawyer's office alone that afternoon, telling my son I had a routine appointment with my GP. My daughter-in-law stayed home. Before I left, she pressed my arm briefly in the hallway, and I told her she had done the right thing. She nodded once, quickly, and looked away. My lawyer sat with the documents for a long time. She read the power of attorney draft twice, making small marks in the margin with a mechanical pencil. Then she looked up and asked me, without any particular alarm in her voice, whether I had authorized any of the transfers she was seeing on the bank records. I told her I had not. She set the pencil down and looked at me steadily. Then she said she needed to make a phone call. She called a colleague who specialized in elder financial abuse. She used that phrase without softening it, which I appreciated. She also recommended I contact the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit rather than the local police, given the amounts involved and the cross-provincial nature of the transfers. She told me not to return home alone that evening if I could avoid it. I called my brother in Burlington on the way back from the office. He'd always had a gift for practical calm in situations that called for it, and he drove down in under 40 minutes and met me at a Tim Hortons off Lakeshore. We sat in a corner booth and I showed him the photographs on my phone, and he was quiet in the specific way he gets when he is deciding not to say what he's actually thinking. He drove back to the house with me. My son seemed genuinely confused to see my brother there. Not alarmed, not caught out confused. He came into the front hall with his hands in his jacket pockets and said it was good to see him and asked if everything was okay. My brother said he'd just come for dinner. We got through that evening without anyone saying what was actually happening. My daughter-in-law made pasta. My brother talked about his grandchildren and the work he was having done on his roof. My son refilled the water glasses and talked about the Burlington property and appeared, as far as I could tell, entirely at ease. I slept very little. The following morning, 2 officers from the OPP Financial Crimes Unit arrived at the house. My son answered the door. I watched from the top of the stairs as the expression on his face moved through several distinct phases in rapid succession: welcome, confusion, calculation, and then something that collapsed inward. He looked up at me. I came downstairs. The investigation took several months, which is how these things go. There were lawyers on both sides, document requests, a forensic accounting firm contracted by my legal team. What they found was more complete than I had imagined and worse in some ways than I had suspected. My son had begun moving money within 11 weeks of my wife's funeral. The transfers had been structured carefully to stay below amounts that trigger automatic reporting flags, a method, the investigators told me, that indicated planning rather than impulse. He had opened the Calgary account 6 months before my wife passed, which placed the timeline somewhere I preferred not to think about too directly. The power of attorney document, had I signed it, would have given him unrestricted authority over all of my financial assets, with no mandatory reporting requirements to me or anyone else. The estate specialist who drafted it had his license under review by the Law Society within a month of the investigation becoming formal. The Hamilton residence had received a preliminary inquiry about availability. The inquiry had been made in my name. What saved me was a folded piece of paper the size of a sticky note, pressed into my hand under a tablecloth while a notary talked about traffic. My daughter-in-law cooperated fully with the investigation from the beginning. She provided every photograph she had taken, every email chain, every document she had accessed. She sat through 3 separate interviews with investigators and answered every question put to her with the same careful precision she had shown me at the kitchen table. My lawyer told me later that the investigators had commented on the quality and organization of what she had gathered, that she had essentially handed them a roadmap. She moved out of the house in January to a rental suite in East Oakville while the proceedings were ongoing. I told her she didn't have to do that. She said she thought it was better for both of us. She came for dinner on Sunday evenings, which my brother still sometimes joined. She had started a new job at a nonprofit in Mississauga that worked with older adults, navigating housing decisions she'd applied the month after the investigation opened, and said nothing about it until she'd been hired. I told her once, sitting at the kitchen table where all of this had happened, that I didn't know what to do with what I owed her. She said I didn't owe her anything. I said she'd saved my life and at minimum my freedom to live it as I chose. She said she'd done what any decent person would do. I told her I wasn't sure most decent people would have done what she did. Most people would have found a reason to look away, to assume they'd misunderstood, to protect their own marriage even when their own marriage had stopped deserving it. She had gathered evidence for 6 weeks in secret, in a house where she was outnumbered, and then she had found a way to tell me with 4 words on a scrap of paper at a dinner table. She shrugged in the specific way she has when she doesn't want to take credit for something, and poured more tea, and changed the subject to a renovation question I'd been meaning to sort out about the back fence. The house is quieter now, but it is different from the quiet that followed my wife's death. That quiet was an absence. This one feels more like space room to be an old man on his own terms, which is something I had not been certain I would get to have. I updated my own power of attorney in February, properly, with my lawyer and my brother as the designated persons, with checks built in that she insisted upon and that I was glad to agree to. My financial advisor has my full access restored and calls me directly once a month. My banking notifications are back on. The bird feeder is full again. I remembered to fill it before the second snowfall, which my wife would have been pleased about. My daughter-in-law texted me last week to say she'd been asked to speak at a community workshop on financial elder abuse, what to watch for, how to document what you find, what your options are when someone you live with is the problem. She asked if I minded her sharing a version of our story, anonymized, as an example. I told her to share whatever helped people. She sent back a single message, "Thank you for trusting me." I thought about that for a while before I answered. I thought about the moment in the hallway under the Georgian Bay watercolor, standing with a folded piece of paper in my hand, listening to my son laugh in my dining room. I thought about how close I had come to putting the note in my pocket and going back to the table and picking up the pen. I told her I thought trusting her was the most sensible thing I'd done in years. Then I put the phone down and went to fill the kettle and stood at the kitchen window watching the snow come off the roof in long, slow sheets in the afternoon light, and the yard was very still, and the maple tree held the bird feeder steady, and I was, against the considerable odds of the past 14 months, entirely all right. If you are an older person and something in your life feels off, something in your finances, something in how decisions are being made around you, something in the way a person who loves you a little too conveniently has begun inserting themselves between you and the information you used to simply have, please do not wait for certainty before you act. The people who do these things to their own families are skilled at making doubt feel like wisdom. They will tell you that you are confused, that you misunderstood, that the concern itself is evidence of your decline. Trust the person who pulls you aside. Trust the note pressed into your palm. Trust the voice in a hallway that says something is wrong before you have the proof to say why. And if you are the person who has noticed something, who is sitting on photographs and email chains in a fear that no one will believe you do what my daughter-in-law did, write it down. Keep going. Find a way to say it even if all you have is a scrap of paper and 4 words, and the hope that the person you're trying to protect will choose to listen. Someone will listen.